Blimps, dirigibles, zeppelins, airships, lighter than aircraft. These are all kind of versions of the same thing. And in your mind, they probably exist in the past. In fact, the 1930s in some ways was a peculiar kind of heyday of that technology. But they also exist in fiction, particularly steampunk and something new called silkpunk, very attracted to the idea of those beautiful airships moving slowly across the sky. But airships are probably also in your future. They're probably in the skies of your future. They are one of the better chances to do zero carbon aviation. We're going to explain all that right after the news. Welcome to our show. Today's show is about, I think the best general category term is airships. That would probably include blimps and zeppelins and dirigibles. I don't know. I'm awaiting my full education about this topic. So today on the show, we're going to begin with speculative fiction, looking at blimps and their various cousins, and then move into the reality of blimps. Blimps are very much a part of the future, particularly as there's an ongoing quest for carbon zero aviation. Well, blimps, that's kind of what they are, or at least potentially that's what they are. So we'll be talking about all of that. But as I say, we're going to begin with speculative fiction. And let me just say one more thing about doing that before I introduce the guest, which is that, when the pandemic started, we really looked at previous speculative fiction about pandemics. And it was amazing how many big themes and small details had been anticipated by these writers. I mean, these writers kind of specialize in seeing around corners. It made me think that in the future, when there are vast policy challenges that require blue ribbon panels, among the people seated on those panels should be speculative fiction people, because they're just, in the case of the pandemic, it came right down to somebody had written a prize-winning speculative fiction short story about people baking a lot during a pandemic lockdown, which is exactly what happened. It was even that granular. All right, so enough. Joining us now is Ken Liu, a speculative fiction author and futurist. He's the author of The Dandelion Dynasty, an epic fantasy, which features airships. And he's going to kind of introduce us to the way blimps live both in reality and in the imagination. Ken Liu, welcome to our show.
Hi, Colin. Thanks for having me.
So let's just begin with you and blimps. We should first of all say that the minute Carmen Baskoff proposed this show, reflexive creature of habit that I am, I said, well, steampunk. That was my immediate reaction. Blimps and steampunk are just kind of inexorably linked. I know what you're calling your genre is a slight adaptation of that, and we'll come to it. But there's a way in which blimps do call out to a certain kind of imaginative writer, and you're one of those writers. Say what the allure is.
I think a lot of it has to do with the romance of air travel by airship. There's something deeply romantic about airships because, airplanes are complicated things, and especially modern jets. It's hard for us to even get a hold of how they work. But blimps are easy. They are, everybody has played with balloons. We know how they stay afloat. We understand how they do what they do. And there's something very comforting about flying in a machine that's lighter than air, and that feels like a cruise ship in the sky.
I will say, on the one occasion that I was up in the Goodyear Blimp, my primary reaction was, wow, this technology looks like it has not changed substantially since 1935.
I think that's pretty accurate, largely because we haven't had to do much with it. It's not entirely true in the sense that a lot of modern airships actually are hybrid vehicles. They're not strictly lighter than air vehicles. Some modern airships are actually heavier than air. They just use the lift gas to reduce the amount of power needed to stay aloft. They actually generate lift very similar to airplanes. But yes, you're right. For the most part, the technology has not changed significantly.
Yeah, there's this big wooden wheel, and I thought I haven't been up this high in something that had a wooden wheel in my life, and it was a little bit disconcerting, but only briefly. So, one of the things that you're attracted to, maybe we should talk about the genre you've kind of coined here, and that's silk punk, and within that is an attraction to what? Well, biomimicry is one word for it, right? Maybe talk about that.
Yeah, sure. So I invented the word silk punk to describe my novels. Essentially, they're epic fantasy novels in which engineers are heroes, not wizards. And the idea is that there's a technology vocabulary in my novels that are derived from primarily East Asian models. So there's a sense in which the materials are drawn from nature, so bamboo, silk, paper, etc. And the methods of engineering are based on imitating natural forms, birds, fish, so on and so forth. And I describe this entire technology aesthetic. And one of the most important ideas is the sense of trying to build technology that's in harmony with nature rather than a strictly conquest of nature. It's a sense that the human made objects can flow and fit within the patterns of nature as though nature had evolved these forms by itself.
And there's some, I mean, that obviously is a flight of imagination, but it's not entirely a flight of imagination. There's ways in which, the in real life airship industry kind of thinks about the same things in a way. I mean, the original, as I understand it, if we go back to the 1930s, the gas bags were cow guts.
Exactly.
They were actually made of just insane numbers of cows. And even now, Boris Pasternak, one of the pioneers of modern airship travel, he was looking at the problem of, apparently, I hadn't really thought about this, but if you use an airship to transport some really, really heavy cargo to some remote place in Alaska that can't be reached any other way, and you drop it there, you have to figure out how you're going to keep your airship from just sailing off into space because it doesn't have that.
That's right.
But I read, I think it was in the New Yorker article that we'll be talking about later, that he thought about the problem for decades studying submarine technology and the swim bladders of bluefish. So, Ken, there's your biomimicry right there.
Absolutely. That's one of the most attractive things about airships to me, as a technologist. I think often about how airships are really just submarines in a different medium. And a lot of the techniques and ideas we learn from building submarines are applicable to airships. But you don't normally think of these two mediums as the same, water and air, but they really are. The vehicles that navigate them, airships and submarines, follow very similar principles.
Right. I have to say, having watched the newly released version of Dune, they actually have an airplane that or some kind of air vehicle that kind of mimics dragonfly wings or something like
that's awesome. It's such a great vehicle. I love watching that machine.
Yeah, there's your biomimicry again. So, I mean, I think that what you're saying is, part of what you're saying is that we often divorce the notion of beauty from the notion of efficacy when we're thinking about modes of transportation. Not to say that a certain airplane can't in its own way be beautiful, but, it's not necessarily a term that I would attach to a 747 I was getting on. And one of the things that you're looking at is there a way to create things that are serviceable but also beautiful against the sky? I just want to point out that your bamboo and silk airships move by means of giant feathered oars. And in your own words, you say, when lit up from inside at night, the airships pulsate through the Empyrean like a jellyfish in an abyss of stars. You don't hear that kind of rhetoric coming out of JetBlue.
Maybe they should try that.
Yeah. So beauty and aesthetics, that's part of it for you, right?
Definitely. I think we actually intuitively feel that way. Technologies that succeed often succeed not just because they're more efficient, but because they are more beautiful and they feel good to us. That aspect of it cannot be ignored. A lot of times beauty is a rule of thumb, a kind of heuristic that we've evolved in our minds to detect things that are better for us, that fit nature. To give you a very simple example, a lot of people feel an innate sense of beauty in what's called vernacular architecture. So that's architecture based on the way people in the place traditionally built things using local materials, as opposed to a very postmodern or modernist sense of brutalism. That's the kind of blocky, concrete-based architecture that's often used for institutional buildings and government buildings that a lot of people find uncomfortable and ugly. There's actually a lot of intuition behind that. The reason we prefer the vernacular is because it is often more in harmony with the environment and better for us, despite all the arguments about why the brutalism style of architecture is better. And I think in other technologies, it's the same. We shouldn't ignore our sense of beauty and our intuition that something fits better with the world we live in. If it fits better, if we feel it fits better, it probably does.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know you're from Connecticut, although I don't know where in Connecticut you're from, but at Trinity College in Hartford, there's a life sciences center. I think it's called the Jacobs Life Sciences Center, and it's a piece of neo-brutalist architecture. And and when I walked into it, my immediate reaction was that the message of this building was that the individual life, whether it's bacterium or human or anything in between, is worth absolutely nothing. It was this life sciences center that was kind of antithetical to the idea of life. And it seems with biomimicry, with the kind of thing that you're writing about, the kind of blimps or airships in your books, you're sort of going in the other direction. How can we sort of thin out the veil between what's alive and what's being used by living creatures?
That's absolutely right. I mean, airships offer a lot of advantages over heavier than air aircraft. Airships are able to take off and land with very little infrastructure. In the heyday of airship technology, a mooring mast was all that's needed. So if you're talking about delivering supplies to remote locations or to places where you don't want to rip up the land to build a giant airport, airships are, there's no competition against an airship. Airships are slower for sure compared to jet airplanes, but do we actually need to get goods around the globe that quickly? With all the supply chain issues we're experiencing now, maybe we need to rethink our obsession with moving, your Amazon purchase one day earlier to you. Maybe that's actually not the best way for us to spend our energy and to devote our resources.
Yeah, and maybe not that much slower if you sort of factor logistics. I read, for example, one estimate that a flight from downtown Seattle to the center of Vancouver in one of the new airships, specifically the Airlander 10, which we're going to talk about later in the show, would take 4 hours and 12 minutes. Now allowing for airport transfers, check-in, security processes, all that kind of stuff. The same trip via current airline service would take 3 hours and 6 minutes. So it's not, there's not a huge, there's basically an hour's difference if, in fact, you can just get into your airship, on the top of a building in downtown Seattle or down by the wharf or something like that, and go where you're going. That starts to cut down on the time differences.
That's right. And also, we've proven that we don't actually need to travel faster than a certain amount. I mean, supersonic passenger service has really not taken off. We don't actually necessarily want to fly that fast. Sometimes fast enough is all we need. And airships can be very competitive.
So as a speculative fiction writer, you would have an interesting perspective on the question. I mean, obviously, there was this time of real sort of technological and engineering foment directed at airships, and it seems to stretch from somewhere in the 1920s through the 1930s. I'm not saying it stops after that, but my sense is there's a lot of excitement about it. People are trying different things. Nations are trying different things. And then, from there, it's maybe a little little bit of surveillance and a lot of advertising, and then some more surveillance. And once in a while,
right.
Charlie Monaghan, an old friend of mine, was saying today that he remembers in the late 50s they used them to watch for sharks along the Jersey Shore. But it became a much more of a niche item. Now it seems as though, particularly based on the conversation we're having right now and we're going to have on this show today, it didn't have to be. It isn't necessarily true that specific technology and specific destinies are inextricably linked together. So do you have thoughts about why we're not using a hell of a lot of airships, blimps, et cetera, right now?
Well, one of the things that I did in my career was as a litigation specialist for high-tech cases. And as part of that, I had to study the history of technology very closely. And one conclusion I've drawn is that the particular technology ladder that we climbed up, the path that we actually took to get to where we are, there's a lot of accidents involved. It's not a determined path. If you reset everything back to 1920, for example, and just run it forward again, things could have evolved very differently. So, for example, right today, we all think of electric cars as a new technology, but it really isn't. If you go back to the turn of the last century, around 1900, you would have seen that about a third of the vehicles in New York City, for example, were actually electric cars. And a lot of people thought electric cars would win over steam cars and internal combustion cars. It turns out that, as a result of discovery of cheap oil in Texas, in the US at least, the success of internal combustion engine cars became what appeared to be inevitable, but it really isn't. It's an accident. Airships follow very similar patterns. It's not obvious from the moment back in the 1920s that airships would lose to airplanes because, as I mentioned, they have a lot of advantages. They don't require the kind of infrastructure that airplanes do, and they often are safer and provide better lift capacity. But as a result of the blockade imposed on Germany, they couldn't get helium. So they ended up using hydrogen for their zeppelins. And then, of course, you had the great disaster of Hindenburg. That, I think, had a lot to do with turning the public off from developing airships. Even though in a different historical timeline, we would have developed safe helium-based zeppelins, and we could have just kept on going down that way. And who knows where we would be now.
Actually, we did a piece. I just want to go back to electric vehicles for a second because we actually discovered that in the early 1900s, as you're saying, there were early EV prototypes that were very popular with women. And partly because they were easier to start than the kind of brute force that was needed to start a combustion engine. And for that reason, they kind of got gendered, to use the term now. And that may have actually also interfered with their adoption. So
that's right. There's a lot of cultural expectation and cultural limits to technology adaptation, and it's just really strange and interesting to go back and see what tiny things ended up making such a big difference.
So I was going to ask the other guest this, but I think you're a better person to think about it. So we're going to be making a pretty compelling argument, I think, as we go along here today for the fact that airships could begin to introduce something resembling zero carbon aviation, something that's desperately needed in the world today. Obviously, the emissions from conventional aviation right now are just a gigantic problem and a gigantic thrust for the climate change problem. Is there anything to be worried about on the other side? And specifically, it occurred to me as I was reading about this that one of the things that blimps or airships would be good at would be transporting, say, I don't know, oil rigging equipment to a place that's not accessible by car or truck. There are certain places, there are a lot of unreachable places in the world, the places that you can't get to easily by a boat or by any kind of land vehicle. And I'm wondering about that. I mean, in some ways, nature does us a favor by keeping our meddling, polluting, climate-wrecking ways out of certain wilderness areas or obscure places. If airships solve the problem, might there be a potential downside?
That is a great question. This is the law of unintended consequences. Sometimes by pushing a technology that's clean, you actually end up making dirty technologies cheaper and therefore more economically viable. I'm not terribly worried about that potential in this case, however, mainly because for something like mining and offshore drilling, bring the equipment to remote places is just one small piece of it. Trying to build the transportation infrastructure to bring the extracted resources out is by far the bigger piece. And airships will not make that piece of it any cheaper. So I'm not terribly concerned about that potential. But you're right. In general, we do need to think through the consequences of making things, quote unquote, cleaner, whether that actually opens up new avenues of making dirty technologies cheaper and therefore more viable.
We're talking right now to Ken Liu, one of several speculative fiction authors who incorporates the idea of a blimp or an airship into his writing. He's the author of The Dandelion Dynasty, an epic fantasy that does feature airships. And we're going to take a little break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk a little bit about the state of blimps, airships, etc. right now.
And from the abattoir, I saw the same things you saw. A fleet of little blimps, a flock of bright and burning battleships that rocked across the town, and then they tore the sky down. While we borrow for words, collecting snail shells inside our skirts. We weren't sure if we'd existed at all. If no one else survived, we keep their memories in.
But Che, when do you take a moment to talk about the important, unimportant things?
What do you mean by that?
Well, the stuff most people don't talk about because technically it doesn't matter. Here, let me take a moment real quick. Hit me. All this talk about the debt ceiling and climate change, but nobody talks about the fact that nobody in here knows one person who drives or operates a blimp.
You say a blimp?
Yes, a blimp. Why do we not know who drives it? Like when someone says, I'm a driver, you don't say, oh, car or blimp? Who is flying these things? I mean, they could fly a plane or a jet. Nah, I want to fly a slow-ass dildo across the sky. For real, I've asked people all across the country that not one person knows a blimp driver. And this might be a dumb question to ask you, but are we sure blimps are real?
I'm pretty sure they're real, Chris.
Exactly, pretty sure. Plus, blimps are slow as hell. You ever seen a fast blimp? No, because that is a missile.
That aired on Weekend Update of Saturday Night Live. We are now going to establish beyond all question and all doubt that blimps are real. And to do that, joining us now are Jean Marie Laskus, journalist who wrote a piece about these kinds of conveyances, airships, for The New Yorker in 2016. Also joining us is Nick Allman, Chief Operating Officer of Hybrid Air Vehicles. He can assert that blimps are real because they make them. But Jean Marie, I'm going to start with you. As you investigated this for your original piece, maybe just to help Chris Red out a little bit, what are the defining characteristics of airships? What makes an airship as opposed to something else that goes through the sky?
Oh, sure thing. Hi, and thanks for having me.
Yeah.
So basically, an airship is like the umbrella term. And underneath airship falls several different types of them. A blimp is usually small, no internal structure, and is basically a balloon powered by something and with a rudder to steer it. That's your most basic form. Then you have two different kinds of what you think of when you think of an airship, the larger and transporting people or goods. And there are really two types, non-rigid and rigid. Rigid are the type that were built by Ferdinand von Zeppelin back in the day. That was the kind of classic thing you saw. It has like a rib cage inside this giant structure of balloon. But actually the lift is by individual cells within that rib structure. And that is the old style of airship. The Hindenburg, for example, was rigid. And typically people will call them zeppelins after Zeppelin, or dirigibles. These terms are pretty much interchangeable. But when you move over to the non-rigid airships, that's what you're seeing mostly being developed today by companies who want to try and get this business off the ground. And there is no internal structure. They're lighter. They're easier to build. You're just basically sewing a big old balloon on the ground. And that's kind of where the technology mostly is, with a few notable exceptions.
Yeah, and before we bring Nick in, I do want to say that your piece, I thought, benefited from the introduction of a character who easily could have been walking around in the pages of one of Ken Liu's novels. His name is Igor Pasternak. Watching the video of him with his big cigars and his suspenders and his kind of Eric Bogosian hair and stuff like that, I was thinking, it almost doesn't seem possible that there's somebody who seems so determinedly the kind of quirky person you might expect to be a blimp or airship visionary. But just mention a little bit about Pasternak and what you learned about him.
Oh, sure. Yeah, he's exactly the character you imagine, but then some. He's, like so many of these folks, obsessed with airships and has been since he was a kid in the Ukraine, and saw a picture of a cargo airship that had never really been developed. And he becomes fixated on that, really, to this day. He's in his late 50s now, and he's still at it. And he's had quite a bit of success with his blimps. He started building them in Russia for advertising. And then, it's kind of the same old story with no money, nothing, comes to the US to try and start that business here and really is a success at it. But they're advertising blimps. They're small. They're just blimps. And that's not his dream. He wants this cargo airship. That is his dream. But even his advertising business switches over to a surveillance business as soon as it's September 11th, 2001. Now everybody wants surveillance. A lot of his blimps are now used for surveillance. But he's got a great company. But he wants the big dream to come true. He ends up getting a lot of capital from the U.S. Military to develop the Dragon Dream, which is about a football field long, 747 wide. That is just the prototype for his dream. The prototype is this large, giant, jumbo structure, and it's rigid, like the old Zeppelins. Very controversial today, rigid. And he develops this thing. He actually builds it, and he actually proves his landing gear system, and more importantly, how to solve the problem you were talking about before of dropping off cargo and then it shoots to the moon. He comes up with a whole system how to solve that problem. He tests it out in California where his hangars are. It's successful. He proves all of his principles. It's huge, roaring. Everyone's jumping for joy. His whole giant team. And then this is 2013. I'd say right the day before the investors were to come and see this miracle fly, in the morning, Igor gets up and goes to the hangar, and here the roof had collapsed onto his Dragon Dream and destroyed it. So everything fell apart, everything. But Igor is that guy who will never give up, and he certainly hasn't.
All right, so I want to bring
still at it.
Yeah, I want to bring into the conversation somebody else who's at it, and that is Nick Allman, Chief Operating Officer of Hybrid Air Vehicles. They are going to be known, I think, primarily for the so-called Airlander, and so we want to find out a little bit more about that. Nick, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a really interesting discussion so far, I thought.
All right, good. Yeah. Well, you're going to make it more interesting. So, First of all, describe the Airlander to us. Tell, what kind of vehicle are we talking about here?
Okay, so we've neatly been introduced here. It's a non-rigid, so it's there's no internal structure. So if you can imagine the shape of two conventional airships, so two cylindrical bodies that were 300 feet long and about 70 feet in diameter. If you took those and you pushed them together in the same way as two bubbles, when they go together, you create effectively a structure inside, a diaphragm joining those two bubbles. And if you could see inside Airlander, you'd see effectively what we've created is two long, thin bubbles stuck together. And that creates a really strong structure for us to then work from. And this is a key, it needs to be efficient. It needs to be relatively easy to manufacture, etc. But the key thing we do is then we use that shape to develop aerodynamic lift when we fly. And that's probably the biggest difference between the conventional airship and what Airlander does. So broadly, we'd sit on the ground and we'd be heavier than air. And then a bit like an aircraft, we use a conventional takeoff. So the aircraft moves forward, generates aerodynamic lift, and flies around using the aerodynamic lift primarily to work with the lift from the helium. So effectively what we're doing is we're taking the helium lift and making that carry the aircraft around, and the aerodynamic lift carries the payload around. And that way we're much, much more efficient than an aircraft.
Let's talk about payload for a second, because in fact, we've already talked a little bit about the use of these for cargo delivery, particularly to areas that aren't conventionally accessible. But there are a lot of other ways that these could be used, and you certainly have not ruled out, and have in fact embraced the idea of these as some kind of passenger service. I've seen pictures of the cabin. It looks very comfortable and nice. I want to go somewhere in an Airlander. But say more about that. How viable is that going to be? Is it going to be like the Roy family in Succession are the only people who can kind of use it, or could just an average schmuck like me wind up traveling that way?
So I think on the first look at the commercial side of Airlander, we started to look at who might be early adopters, because there's no doubt the first few aircraft that are available. It's a very different situation to when this becomes a normal thing that everybody's used to seeing. So initially, we looked at tourism on a luxurious scale, where you might take a small group of people, probably with cabins on board, and take them on a 2 or 3 day cruise to go and see something that is almost impossible to go and see at the moment. So you could, for example, go on a safari while having you'll be able to stay on board, stay floating over the plains in Africa, and the whole time being able to look out it through huge windows that are fundamentally all of the side of the area you'd be sitting in will be all windows. And that's certainly where we thought we'd break into the commercial market, and it I think may still be the first few aircraft. What of course has happened, particularly over the last couple of years, is a huge move towards trying to take carbon out of aviation. I mean, as we said earlier in the discussion, production of carbon is a huge problem for aviation. What we found by coming up with a slightly different approach to the part that people go in the aircraft, a bit underneath our hull, is we create a huge space. And in that space, we can create enough space for 90 to 100 people who everybody has an aisle seat. Everybody has a great view, and you can travel in a totally different environment. So as you were talking earlier, it may take a little longer, but it's a totally different experience, and one that we think people will be able to either enjoy or potentially work in, because that environment will be so different. And so that's generated a lot of interest. We're deep in discussions with a number of airlines who are looking at using the aircraft in that shuttle between places which are currently a little bit difficult. to get to and from.
I think it's a trade that a lot of people would make. I would make that trade, just to, as you say, I wouldn't have to necessarily deal with an airport. Maybe I can get into the airship at the docks in Seattle or whatever. I wouldn't have to be dealing with all kinds of things that I hate about air travel, and I would have a very pleasant trip, and there would be beautiful views. But also, a lot of us are having to deal now with personal responsibility and guilt. And so these may not be up-to-date figures, and feel free to correct them. But the thing that I read about a hypothetical flight from Seattle to Vancouver would generate 4.61 kilograms of CO2 per passenger. A conventional airline service, it would be 53.15 kilograms per passenger. So, I mean, you would be that would be more than 10 times the emissions of your airship.
Completely. And when you look at the other ideas that are around for reducing the carbon footprint of aviation, they are generally knocking a few percent off here and a few percent there. What we're able to offer here is ways to make huge inroads into that carbon production that is such an issue. Getting that understood by a wider audience is not necessarily easy. Going back to the question of why is the world not full of airships already? And there aren't really any good answers to that, other than what you need is the technology needs to be at a point where it's ready, which we believe it is. But you also have to move past producing one-off prototypes, which we've done, and be bold enough to go, right, we believe this is going to be a huge commercial success, and we have to bring that commercial success to fruition. You've got to, and that's what we're doing at the moment, is working really hard to make sure that these do become something that people are just used to seeing and become more normal.
So, Jean-Marie Laskus, I want to bring you back into the conversation. In the piece that you wrote, you looked at a lot of different versions of the same vision, but those versions included different purposes, different uses of airship technology. Can you say a little bit more about that? I mean, we just heard a vision of passenger service, but what are the different kinds of things that you found entrepreneurs in this area talking about?
Well, that's so interesting to hear Nick talk, because that is what I wanted that dream of passenger airships like that. I just wanted somebody to tell me, yes, you're going to have that. I mean, I couldn't let go of it. But inevitably, when I talk to the engineers, so much of the focus is on cargo transport or surveillance, mostly cargo transport, that big dream. Mm-hmm. And I think that the main issue everyone was coming up against over and over again was the enormous amount of capital that you need to raise just to build the prototype. And so where are these investors all going to come from, and how they're all sort of fighting for the same government dollars around the world. So that seemed to be like, the stopping point for so many of them. But you even have like Lockheed Martin is been working on one for 25 years in their Skunk Works operation, like super secret underground crazy thing. And it's interesting because in 2016, when I was visiting, it was going to be ready. The prototype, everything. We're supposed to see this, and I haven't seen anything from them yet. And you kind of hear that a lot. You get excited and then everybody goes dark for a while. So it's like, I don't know if they're waiting for the investments to come through or the technology isn't quite where they want it to be. But it just feels like we're on the verge of something, this great dream. And I'm so happy to hear that the airlander is thinking of this as commercial. But I'm just like wondering, is that a viable, how I guess I would ask Nick this, is it, how do you imagine a viable business? Like, do you need the cargo airship giant version in order to support the, passenger vehicles?
I think the interesting thing, and I think things have changed in the last few years. I think the people are now prepared to talk about flying more slowly to produce less carbon. People are prepared to think of different ways of doing things. I mean, the small electric EV aircraft, taxis, and things. All these things are now beginning to be looked at more seriously. And I think what we've demonstrated to ourselves and our investors is that there is a good commercial model for building reasonably large numbers of aircraft, primarily for the commercial market, at what we call our Airlander 10 size, so our initial starting vehicle, so 10-ton lift vehicle. And that stands on its own as a really good commercial proposition, both for us as a manufacturer, but obviously more importantly for our customers, is that it's clear that people are going to be able to offer similar price tickets, producing much lower carbon, and they'll still be making money. And unfortunately, in the world, that's the driver. We may have dreams and think things are a really good idea, but unless people are going to make money out of them, things don't happen. And I think that's where we see the biggest change. Is it's now relatively easy to demonstrate that this is going to work. And yes, we have been in a phase where finding that funding for the final part of the productionization, that takes time.
All right, we're just going to pause the conversation here for 2 seconds. We just have to do a very, very quick break. We'll come back with Jean Marie and with Nick after this.
Do you wanna ride in my blimp, girl? Do you wanna ride in my blimp? See the night sky in my blimp, girl. Do you wanna ride in my blimp? Do you wanna dine in my blimp, girl? Do you wanna dine in my blimp? Red wine and some shrimp, girl. Do you wanna dine in my blimp? Do you wanna love in my blimp, girl? Do you wanna love in my blimp? I own an entire blimp, girl. So do you wanna ride in my blimp?
The technical producer of today's show, as always, is our technical producer, Kat Pastor. And this show is being produced by former Where We Live producer, Carmen Baskoff, who's currently living in Brussels as a double agent under the name Bridget von Hammersnark. I probably wasn't supposed to say that. Kat, maybe we can edit that out for the podcast or something like that so she doesn't get killed. All right, so we're back. We're talking about airships, which includes blimps, dirigibles, zeppelins. You get the idea. And joining us are two people who have different kinds of expertise in them. Jean Marie Laskus, a journalist who wrote about them for The New Yorker. Nick Allman, Chief Operating Officer of Hybrid Air Vehicles. So, Jean Marie, looking also at the history of these kinds of airships. I mean, in the 1930s, another thing that hurt them, I was talking to Ken Liu about this earlier, like what's the determinative path that either brings something to market and commonplace use or doesn't? I mean, one thing that hurt them, we have to be honest, is crashes, particularly the Hindenburg. That was the most documented one. It wasn't the worst one, but from about 1923 to about 1937, there were some pretty notable crashes of these kinds of craft, and that is going to erode confidence in them, I assume.
Oh, most definitely. And certainly the Hindenburg, because it was captured on film, that is when the public just became, completely like, oops, never mind. But I do want to say, and there was, before that, in Britain, there was the R101. That was a luxury liner designed to carry royalty across the British Empire. And that also crashed.
Killing the air minister.
That was tragic.
Killing the British air minister who had been the propulsion behind the program.
Right. And 48 other people. So it was, that was really tragic. But I do want to say, if you look back at the early Zeppelins and how many flights, 1,500 flights or something in 1914. So, and even all these things, like in the US, we were designing flying aircraft carriers, and we built them, 2 of them, that were supposed to release fleets of Sparrowhawks, fighter planes. And we built them, but they crashed in storms. So yeah, the technology now, though, just think about it in terms of satellite capability and anticipating weather. I mean, it's really different now. But boy, all those flights they made successfully. And it was just as a matter of, that's all there was. There was no rigid aircraft.
Good point.
In the
So
1900s. So
yeah. So I want to switch over to Nick Allman for a second because we're close to running out of time. It seems to me that it takes a certain amount of nerve to do something like this because, in fact, it's a technology that people don't have quite the pre-existing relationship that they could. And because, I don't know, a lot of people have had trouble getting these kinds of businesses, you should pardon the expression, off the ground. The legendary Roger Monk, who comes up the minute you start reading up about this, I think he had 4 different companies that didn't quite make it. So what gives you the guts to do something like this? What gives you the guts to start a company and believe you can get airships in the sky viably commercial?
Well, I guess I have to admit that I did work for Roger.
Okay.
And I mean that in a way that, so he was definitely an inspiration early on. So I have been involved in this now for 20 years. So it obviously is really important to believe in what you're doing. And I don't think anybody involved in these sorts of things, you can't do that unless you fundamentally believe it. What we've been able to do is keep a team of people together who understand what we're trying to do. We've been through the prototyping phase, which was really hard, and we learned an unbelievable amount, as everybody does when you're prototyping anything. What you then get to is a point where you go, right, I now know this is going to work. I now know that it's going to do something in the world that nobody else can do. We're going to provide a product that is, at least initially, without competition, and that's within our grasp. And then you turn then to a different problem. This isn't a problem of science or technology. This is a problem of financing, fundamentally. And I think probably 5 years ago we thought that would be hard, but probably we didn't realize quite how hard that is. The world is not particularly interested in taking risks where the payback is 6, 7, 8 years away. And so it's taken time. But all the time since we last talked to Gene, we have been working literally day and night to build that position that we now feel we're in, where somebody can go, right now I understand this, I can see this business model, I can see this is going to be successful. And we're now talking to people who are able to help us through this next phase.
We're almost out of time, but real quickly, Nick, could you consider give us a timeline? Like how soon might there be these kinds of things available for someone, not involved with the initial prototype and the growth of the company? When could somebody expect to have some kind of access to one of your airships?
So I think we're probably looking at something like 3 years before you'll see a production aircraft flying. And then to ensure the safety of the product, we obviously have to spend time testing that and getting our full aircraft type certification as you would for a Boeing 747. So it's probably the mid-2020s when people will be able to turn up somewhere, buy a ticket, and just go on a flight.
Well, I can't wait. I don't think I can wait that long.
No,
Work faster, Nick. I'm 67 years old. I've only got so much time left. All right. It's been great to talk to you and to Jean Marie Laskus and to Ken Liu. Thanks to all of you who listened, and a special thanks to, what did I say her name was? Bridget von Hammersnark, our producer, who's living in Brussels right now and who's not at all Carmen Baskoff. Forget I ever said that.